So yeah,
both of us, or just
both of us. Yeah.
both
So if
of
we
us?
just talk to each other, then we'll be able to
Okay.
pick up whether that's sounding okay on the other end. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Can you hear me, Mr. Soundman? That's good.
Right. You good? Yep. You picking me up? Okay. Right. Picking me up for sound in room in. So Adam is a writer, a filmmaker, a scholar, an adventurer, kind of pretty much everything, really. And we have built this talk as sort of folk horror and landscape as the sort of subject matter. But I think there's going to have a few uninitiated people here, so I'm gonna suggest that Adam maybe start off by introducing us to the subject. What exactly is folk horror?
Okay, well, firstly, thank you for coming on a lovely day to hear us talk about really macabre, dark, and really quite wintry things. Folk horror. A few years ago, it was whatever you really wanted it to be, if we're being honest. But now that academics and the like have got hold of it, we need to be a bit more careful about how we define these things. But in general terms, folk horror is media that finds dread through rendering place, tradition, superstition, and belief as actively hostile. Often within the narratives of folk horror, whether they be in literature, television, cinema, there is often an emphasis on rural landscapes. And those rural landscapes can be very isolating for the communities and individuals that are within them. And this tends to skew their vision of the world, especially their morality. And this often leads to either violence, ritualistic violence in particular, or something more esoteric, like a summoning, something demonic, something supernatural. When we talk about folk horror, it's generally coming from ideas from cinema, especially British cinema. There are 3 films in the late 60s and early 70s that really kickstart folk horror as a thing and not just a random collection of stories and writers and other media. It starts in 1968 with a film called Witchfinder General by Michael Reeves with Vincent Price. And then it follows 2 years later with another film called The Blood on Satan's Claw by V.S. Haggard, and then ends with the most famous one, 1973, is The Wicker Man by Robin Hardy. And those 3 films generally cover the basic bones of what folk horror is. If you've seen any of those 3 films, you will have some sense of what folk horror does and how it uses landscape and what often happens at the end of those films.
Okay, and what sort of what's your tie to this subject? What got you into sort of studying this, into writing about this?
It's being quite nerdy, really. So I think very early on, I don't know if I should admit to this, really. I was a Doctor Who fan. And Doctor Who, let's say a yay then. My people are here.
Yeah.
Doctor Who as a program is a big genre magpie. It takes from everything. And in the 70s in particular, it took from folk horror, especially in the John Pertwee era. And I love those stories. And then as I grew up, I realized, looking back at older media, whether it be books or in particular older British television, which loved folk horror, there was just a rich seam of television shows that really hit home, especially if you had an interest in rural landscapes, whether just casually or actively going into them for pleasure or for whatever else. And it stems, unfortunately, from that nerdy appreciation of Doctor Who. But actually, Doctor Who is a great gateway drug to finding lots of other things, whether it be older archive television, other genres, literature, that sort of thing. And it stems from that, really. And then gradually I started to write about it in the early 2010s, when it became clear that actually there was this quite large body of work globally, not just British, that wasn't necessarily being connected, even though they had lots of similarities and connections. And it's become this quite monstrous thing now, in which lots of people are actually making work actively as folk horror, which, as something I haven't said, is that actually all of the older work generally was just tapping into the atmosphere of the eras rather than being something that was actively made as folk horror. Whereas now it's a popular thing, it's a genre which is recognized, and people actively write books and make TV shows and make films as folk horror.
Yeah, so it's sort of a genre that's been like retroactively applied to things that were perhaps more just had a certain feel to them, of being sort of eerie and uncanny and strange. So we've obviously the other side. Yeah.
It's quite hard to make out what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we have the sound up a little bit? Is that better? Yeah. Okay. We're good. Okay. So obviously landscape then plays a huge part in this genre and the way that it's sort of classified maybe retroactively. What's the sort of types of landscapes that tend to be picked up on in these films and these books?
Well, they tend to be centered around sort of agricultural landscapes, really. Think of the Wicker Man. The island in the Wicker Man is all about growing fruits, growing apples, and the reason why Edward Woodward faces the fate that he faces is because the apples and the orchards have failed that year. Blood on Satan's Claw is again rural and agricultural. The opening shots are all about ploughing the land. Witchfinder General isn't quite agricultural. That's set in East Anglia, but that's set in the Civil War, which is again vast East Anglian plains. There's a strong theme of this in East Anglia, actually, generally, sort of Norfolk and Suffolk especially, but generally any rural realm which is away from the cities is ripe for this stuff. That isn't to say that cities can't do this. There is a cousin of folk horror, if you like, which stems roughly from Nigel Neal's Quatermass series, in particular Quatermass in the Pit, which actually finds just as much of this kind of horror and terror in central London. And there's actually quite a few films that do this. It doesn't work in quite the same way, but there are overlaps between folklore and tradition and superstition being weaponized in the same way.
Yeah. So, I mean, you titled this talk, The Unquiet Landscape. And I really liked that term because it sort of creates that sense of like the landscape itself having sort of emotion or sentience or some sense of purpose. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think so. The thing is with folk horror is that it's almost modal. There's a kind of mode, and that there's lots of different modes which have some overlap. But doesn't quite result in the same thing. And the reason I called this talk the Unquiet Landscape is because really my real love at the moment is something that Robert McFarlane, the writer, has called the English Eerie, which is a kind of cousin of folk horror, and it stems in particular from the ghost stories of M.R. James, who I'll read about later. But essentially it works in a slightly different way to folk horror in that it's quieter, it's a glimpsed horror, it's very peripheral, and it doesn't come into your face in the same way that really visceral horror does. It's almost like a creeping dread, like the ghost stories of M.R. James. So there's lots of different ways in which you can use these landscapes. They don't necessarily have to be something is ploughed up and then a demon arises, which is the sort of folk horror cliche that you dig up something from the land. You can actually have something which is more ethereal, something which is more at the side of your peripheral vision, just haunting you in the way that M.R. James's ghost stories function.
Do you want to do the reading about M.R. James next, since we're leading on to that one? If you're talking about him, would that be, or do you want to do the other one first? With
no, we can do M.R. James.
Yeah, okay. So let's. So Adam has a couple of articles, I suppose you call them, chapters from his book here that he's going to read us some parts from. And this first one is specifically about writer M.R. James. So if we maybe hear the reading and then we'll talk a bit more about that afterwards.
So I'll actually give a quick intro to M.R. James for those who don't know who he is. But basically he is the godfather of the English ghost story. I think it's widely accepted that very few writers have done it better than him and have caused many sleepless nights for readers for over 100 years now. He was not primarily a writer of fiction. He was an academic who specialized in religious antiquity at King's College, Cambridge. And these stories were essentially his hobby. But as with all things, the thing that he concentrated on wasn't the thing that he became famous and known for, even though his academic career was unparalleled in what he did. He was a very precocious young man, certainly in his youth. And the ghost stories of M.R. James are absolutely the epitome of what we've just been discussing about landscape, about the eeriness of certain English landscapes in particular. As I'll read now, James is an East Anglian from Suffolk. Even though he was born in Kent, he moved very quickly to Suffolk. And I think for me, as at least, James is the example best to get across what I've been talking about. So I'm going to read a short chapter on him, which is all about his childhood growing up and how his childhood actually affected his view of ghosts and his writing about ghosts in his stories. Some landscapes become unsettled after reading the ghost stories of M.R. James. With an eye for place and detail, bringing authenticity to their recreation, James turned rural landscapes into realms where vengeful demons roamed the northern aspects of county churchyards, and cursed whistles lay waiting just under the crumbling earth of burial grounds. Though equally at home in Eton and King's College, Cambridge, having been provost of both, James's heart really lay in the East Anglian landscape, hazy, flat, and with endless horizons. Though such landscapes feature only a handful of his noted ghost stories, such is their effective rendering that it's difficult to envisage his ghosts without first seeing those evocative topographies stretching out into the distance. Horizon lines in James's work are daunting, not in their picturesque beauty, but in the constant threat that they may be broken by something, a figure perhaps, or something worse. This was the landscape of James's childhood, arguably one of the key pillars of what would stabilize his ghost stories. As Mark Gatiss suggested in his 2013 documentary, the roots of Monty's stories lay in his childhood in England, where his fascination with history and the supernatural was shaped. Though born in Kent, James's family moved to Suffolk when he was 3. James's father, Herbert, was offered the parish at Great Livermere, which included the grand housing of the rectory. James's childhood there was a happy one, but also an unusual one, surrounded by extensive images of religious antiquity and isolated by the countryside. Michael Cox, James's biographer, has suggested that his childhood there was pivotal to the ghost stories. The countryside immediately surrounding Livermere Rectory, so he wrote, made a lasting impression on Monty. This is never more obvious in James's output than in his final published ghost story, one that was never collected in previous volumes, but instead published in the London Mercury periodical in 1936. The story is called A Vignette and is an unusually autobiographical tale clearly lifted from James's childhood at what is now Livermere Hall. You are asked to think of the spacious garden of a country rectory, he begins, adjacent to a park of many acres and separated by a belt of trees of some age which we knew of as the plantation. A closed gate of split oak leads to it from the path encircling the garden, and when you enter it from the side, you put your hand through a square hole cut in it and lift the hook to pass along to the iron gate which admits to the park. This is precisely the geography of the rectory. The tale is poignant as, like in other aspects of James's work, there's a sense of reality behind it. However, the difference here is that James's mode feels eerily confessional rather than simply sticking to the imagery that he knew, genuinely detailing a childhood encounter with the supernatural. The ghosts manifested in one of James's most unusual depictions, seeming to the wall was shadowed by trees which extended all the way around the property like a barrier. There was a rusted gate, more organic than metal, though it was not far enough to be the gate of the story. In another documentary on James, Clive Dunn's A Pleasant Terror, the spot in question is visited after being photographed by the previously mentioned biographer Michael Cox. Behind the house lies the land in question, stretching as far as the eye can see towards the woods and beyond. East Anglian skies forever threaten to drown the land, their constant expanse like an upended sea. Unlike in the documentary in which a local points to where the gate was, the land today has been left to grow wild, the wall now protected by a healthy current of nettles and entanglements of bramble and ivy. I wandered closer but could barely make out the wall, never mind its haunted gap. My eye instead turned towards the land as it retreated behind, the sunset fragmenting the sky into a rich array of purples. James's final story feels like an explanation of sorts, a portrait of an event which haunted him for the rest of his life, sparking an interest in the supernatural which, in the dry academic rigor of his later life, required some form of release. If the story is truly autobiographical, then Great Livermere is arguably the root of his work, a location in which the trees watch on, shrouds hover behind creaking oak gates, and the solitude of the Brecklands is constantly threatened by things unseen. I walked quickly along the gravel path back to the car as the sun dived low and darkness swept across the fields with unusual agency. I shuffled my feet in the gravel deliberately with each step, in order to hide the sound of any potential crunches of a pair quietly following my own. Such things have, after all, been known. Thank you.
Okay. So that sort of description in M.R. James's work there is obviously very evocative of a real place, and a real place that you have now visited. So, and that's something you do quite a bit, isn't it? You like to go and find these places and have a look around.
Yeah, I don't really live in the real world for quite a lot of the time. One of my jobs is that for the British Film Institute, I have to revisit locations that are used in films, and that's my main job, really. It's my main income, and so I am constantly looking at places with this unusual lens through which I'm looking at it through my own perception of being there and also the perception of a filmmaker who's shot it. But I also like to do that with literature as well, especially literature which has been really heavily influenced by a real place, or even the place that a writer's from. M.R. James is a good example, but you could easily go and visit the landscapes that influenced J.G. Ballard or Thomas Hardy, or if you wanted to go to France, you could look at the landscapes of Marguerite Duras or Gustave Flaubert. You can do it virtually anywhere, and I do think it brings clarity to understanding some of their work. Certainly if it's more complicated as well, it can be quite a useful thing to do.
I feel like this is a good place to maybe circle back to you mentioned about your collaborations with Robert McFarlane, and I feel like this might be a really good place to hit upon that, because some of the places that you visit from fiction and so on, from film, you do your own filmmaking as well, don't you? And you've got these collaborations where you've been to some locations from Robert McFarlane's work, where you've done sort of filmmaking there. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Ness, the location?
I started working with Robert on adaptations of his films in 2015, and ironically, the first one we did was filmed in Dorset. It was an adaptation of his very short book, Holloway, and it was all about the Holloways, those overgrown paths that virtually arch through leaves around the chalk coast, essentially. And I film on Super 8 as well, and analog media can be very haunting in itself, and I like that. So I've always worked with Robert on Super 8 adaptations of his books or other projects. But Ness was our last one, which was again an adaptation of his book, which was about the Orford Ness X nuclear testing facility on the Suffolk coast. It is what it is, I suppose. It was an adaptation of his book. I think filming in Dorset was actually more interesting, ironically, because I was on my own to film in Dorset on those paths, and I filmed in those paths for that film in January. And there was a path in particular I remember called Hell Lane, and it was aptly named, not least because looking back at the footage, there was a weird shroud in the paths, and I'd never go there again. I'm not particularly superstitious, or I'm ambivalent about the supernatural, but I wasn't when I was filming on Hell Lane in Dorset.
Gosh, okay.
But generally, I like working on analog, and it suited those books by Robert in particular, because Robert worked with this amazing artist called Stanley Donwood, who's better known for the artwork for Radiohead. He does all of Radiohead's album artwork, and he has these wonderful cross-hatched drawings, and so it felt right to film on Super 8 to capture those same landscapes. But they are haunted landscapes.
Yes, haunted is the right word. I think I watched a little bit of the video that you took at Ness, and it's sort of an abandoned complex now, isn't it? It's all overgrown and tumbled down, and but it's got some really sort of interesting shaped buildings, and you obviously had a bit of an explore of this sort of like abandoned landscape, and I feel like it's a good way to lead us into your second reading that you want to do, because I feel like that it's the kind of landscape that feels like it remembers what was done there a little bit, and your second reading is a little bit about that, about landscapes and the impact of our behaviour and the landscape on our behaviour. So do you want to introduce that one?
I'll seek into it first, because the landscapes I'm about to talk about are connected to a wonderful writer called Alan Garner. Alan Garner is from the northwest of England, specifically Alderley Edge, and the landscapes that he writes about and has written about his whole life are very picturesque and beautiful, and nothing like an ex-nuclear testing facility like Orford Ness. As eerily beautiful as Orford Ness is, and it has inspired a lot of artwork. You know, W.G. Zabald's The Rings of Saturn has a whole segment about it. Chris Pettit, the filmmaker's film. There's all sorts of artists have filmed that and made work about it. Alan Garner is slightly different in that he's drawing on both a very quite well-known mythology of that area, sort of Arthurian legend and that sort of thing, but also his personal relationship to the landscape in a variety of novels. Firstly, novels aimed at a younger audience, at children, and then gradually, as he's progressed throughout his career, blurring that line and making quite complicated novels, even if initially they were quite naively, I think, targeted just at kids, and kids were fine with them, but then adults started to read them and were quite confused because they were quite complex. So I'll read about Alan Garner. We can talk about him afterwards, but a very different writer actually. But we'll get that from the reading. But this is all about Alan Garner's remembered landscapes. Throughout his career, Alan Garner has dedicated many books to questioning the landscape of his native Alderley Edge in Cheshire. Under the guise of the fantastical, at the heart of all of Garner's work lies a sense of place, dictating the direction of his stories. Alderley is not a mere narrative device so much as an expression of personal experience. Garner not only still lives in the location, but is continually haunted by it. More than most British writers, Garner has lived the places of his books. It's a rare feature in the age of extended travel and a globalized populace. He has spent most of his life in and around Alderley, predominantly in Congleton under the shadow of the Lovell telescope of Dodgell Bank. It's a place imbued with strange tales and folklore, where the cosmic and the archaic intertwine with ease. In particular, Garner has been fixated on the edge that gives Alderley its name, a stone precipice with sweeping views out over the Cheshire Plains, all the way to Manchester when the skies are clear. From his debut novel, The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, to his memoir, Where Shall We Run To, place is fixed, not simply to set the scene or to provide a backdrop, but because it defines everything in Garner's work. Garner's prose is carved from rock and wood, giving the impression that it has always been here, and the feeling that he is continuing the tradition of his craftsman heritage. Considering a memoir by Garner is in itself an intriguing proposition, if only because his work has so often been drenched in biography and the place that coloured it. Is one really necessary when the man's history is there in between the wizards and time shifts of his fiction? On a wall near the house of his birth, his forefather's name is cut into the stone, a signature of a modest masonry achievement and a call from those once there to future ancestors. Garner's prose is the same modest signature, etched from the elements of the land remembered and of the remembering land. Especially in his fiction, Garner places land on par with character. In his novel, The Owl Service, for example, the majority of the book is taken up either with dialogue or place description. There's very little in between. This binary allows for a melding of inner and outer worlds, meaning the reader can see quite plainly how place slowly becomes pivotal to the lives of the characters. Rarely do they fail to mention or imply some aspect of the location. The roads, paths, hills, forests, peaks, and fields that surround them make up a fair amount of their discussion. They remember the land even when they wish to forget it. Susan and Colin of the Weirdstone trilogy walk the same paths that Garner walked with his father, around the edge itself, up to Stormy Point and past the various wells that litter the area. One in particular stands out, the Wizard's Well, that's rumoured to be a product of Garner's great-great-grandfather, its carved wizard face specifically. It's the same wizard who would eventually turn up as Cadellan Silverbrow in the Weirdstone of Brisingamen. As Garner wrote in that book, just as they were about to turn for home after a climb from the foot of the edge, the children came upon a stone trough into which water was dripping from an overhanging cliff, and high in the rock was carved the face of a bearded man. The passage could easily be from Garner's memoir, Where Shall We Run To?, with its detail gleaned from memory. It's fitting that a similar narrative of wandering with his father found its way into his memoir. If anything is remembered from Garner's past, it's almost always enshrined in place. Even when his emotions are the overriding element being summoned, and as in his novel Redshift, they are almost always remembered through and preserved by place like an insect in amber. In an essay from The Voice That Thunders, Garner writes of the edge that it both stopped and melted time. In his fiction and essay writing, the landscapes of Cheshire, Wales, and Alderley have potential sentience. If his characters at any point forget the importance of the place around them, then it will do its utmost to remind them. Alison of the Owl Service and her frustration at being stuck on holiday in the Mordway Valley is a good example of this, as is Ian in Fursbitch, who is reluctant to leave the ailing Sal to the mercy of the temporally permeable Pennines. Ever since Redshift, temporal shifts have dominated Garner's landscapes, often hinting towards a kind of agency. The three male characters of Redshift, Ian and Sal of Fursbitch, and even William Buckley of Strandloper, all partake in some unspoken communion with the terrain around them, as if the past filters in and allows access to some deeper truth. Reading Garner's non-fiction, this is clearly reflective of his own relationship with the land. However, to label the latter as an expression of psychology undermines what is really happening. Psychology seeks answers. Garner's writing, on the other hand, is pure expression, intuition even. Place instead haunts through names and language, sometimes so intensely localized and unfamiliar and idiosyncratic to the northwest of England, that they seem possessed of incantation as much as geography. This emphasis on locality feels like a form of remembering, an interaction beyond exploration and normal language. It tells of a dangerous openness to place if unaware or dark of heart. In another essay, Garner wrote of the edge that it is physically and emotionally dangerous. No one born to the edge questions that, and we showed it proper respect. This respect is not superstitious or even melodramatic. It's simply an acknowledgement of a heightened awareness of place in temporal terms, one that is part of a shared continuity with generations gone by. The past is not fixed underneath the rock and soil, but constantly drifting back and forth as the land remembers, even when we briefly forget. Thank you.
It's that phrase, as the land remembers, isn't it? So like it's quite sort of...
Well, if you've gone to some of those places, not necessarily the elderly, but we've all been to places that you get a sense of where you are at that moment because of the place around you. And I think rural places are especially open to that. But there's also something quite uncanny about that relationship as well. If you do go to that kind of place and you do get a sense of standing there and time being permeable, not in a literal sense, but certainly in an emotional sense, it can be quite inspiring if you're a writer or a filmmaker. I think generally it can be quite a pleasant thing in itself if you're just a rambler or just walking somewhere that you've been in that place at that time and you feel it's not fixed, it's just you're just part of it. So you're not standing in the same river twice, sort of thing.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I've heard it sort of sometimes referred to as sort of psychogeography, as sort of like this impact of the land on people's psychology within that, when they're in those spaces. So, do you have any other examples of that sort of thing? Places you've been, or other examples from other fiction or films?
Well, it's difficult for me because often I have to go to places with other people's work in mind because it's my job. But sometimes if I really love the work that has taken me to that place, then that can be quite a rewarding and wonderful feeling. I remember when I first started doing the film location work for the BFI, and I went to the locations used by the Italian director Michelangelo Antonioni in the film Blow Up with David Hemmings. And my vision of London had been dictated by that film, as naive as that is. And going to those locations was almost a ritual in itself. It was the first job I did, and that gave me that same feeling.
Wow.
But personally, probably not creatively, no. Personally, we all go to places and get a sense of them, and we remember that place, and remember when we went there and there was that wall and we did this. I think that's actually I imagine as time goes on, that becomes quite a powerful thing in terms of memory.
It's almost like a kind of sense memory sort of thing. So I was just thinking about the fact that you described Alan as both a writer of fiction and of non-fiction. Obviously, he's an essayist. Do you see him as a little bit of a personal inspiration for you? Or?
Oh God, yeah. I can't think of many writers living and working today who I admire more. I'm just glad that there was a period, certainly in my lifetime, where he was there, but he wasn't quite acknowledged in the same way that other writers, certainly of his stature, in my opinion, were. And then only a few years ago, he finally got nominated for the Booker Prize for a book called Treacle Walker. And all of a sudden, everyone in the publishing world and literary world was going, "Oh, Alan Garner," and it was like, finally, they've got it. I think his writing grows with people because he's started as a children's writer, so you can read his books very early on in life and they can get their claws into you, and then gradually as you get older you can progress to his more adult books, perhaps his more complex books, and certainly his non-fiction, which is often archaeology based. Quite a lot of his non-fiction is all about his own archaeology because he's an archaeologist as well. There's a wonderful story that he has finding this trowel, and it had been in his school and he remembers it as a child, and he spent about 30 to 40 years trying to prove that this trowel was a Neolithic item, and all of the archaeologists and scientists weren't having it. And then finally the technology came along in his lifetime to test it, and he'd been completely right, and he had basically intuited it from childhood that he'd seen this, what looked to be basically a load of rubbish in his school, and it was this awesome piece of Neolithic artifact. And
seems like a man who's very has a lot of patience.
Patience and obsession. He's quite an obsessive person by all accounts. So I think when you embed yourself into that land, he's like sort of a local tree. I think he's there. He's got his roots there, and he grows, and he's stubbornly there, and he will write about there until his dying day, I think.
Yeah, you said his sort of earlier children's fiction is quite a good way into his writing. And am I right? The Owl Service is one of those books.
Yes, I mean that's one of his prize-winning ones.
Yes, one of the more well-known ones. And obviously that was adapted as a television series in the 1960s. I want to say. So and obviously so he's been an influence on film and television, as have many of these writers, like M.R. James as well. With we have a wonderful adaptation of Whistle, and I'll come to you, that often gets trotted out as a very good example of these things. So what do you sort of like see as like threads that have been passed on from sort of authors in that sort of earlier period of time, then leading into this sort of very strong British tradition of these films and television series?
Well, I think if you watch Mark Gatiss's Christmas ghost stories that have been going on now each year since about 2013, they happen because of M.R. James. While there was a tradition in the 1970s for adapting them, there was a very long period from basically 1980 up until the early 2000s when they weren't on screen anymore. And there were one or two in the early 2000s, but Mark kickstarted the tradition off again. And the only way to really do it at the BBC, because you have to argue to make things at the BBC, is to say, well, M.R. James's stories are terrifying, let's do them, and we can do a documentary about it, which he did for the first time round. And that has allowed him to now do a ghost story for Christmas every year and move away from M.R. James. The last two have been, one was by E.F. Benson and another was by Arthur Conan Doyle. So he's created this slot, but its heritage is James. So that's a lineage in itself. But the amount of filmmakers that I interview and talk to that are influenced by adaptations of James's work in particular, or James himself, it's almost like a tick box thing. I'm influenced by Whistle and I'll Come To. I'm influenced by M.R. James's stories. I watched a film recently, which I did a little thing for a screening, called The Rose of Nevada, by a really great Cornish filmmaker called Mark Jenkin. And his films have been heavily influenced by adaptations of James, even though they're not necessarily straightforward ghost stories. So there's all of these programs, especially in the 60s and 70s, have a through thread to a lot of the culture now. It's very influential, and it's unusual really when you think about it, because a lot of these things were made on a shoestring, and they were made. The Christmas ghost stories went out very late at night once in the 70s, and yet they had such an impact that word of mouth meant that they kept them alive. Like, do you remember going to see? Do you remember that Christmas Eve when we watched, Peter Vaughan being chased by a ghost, or all these great actors who were in them? But they stayed in the memory, and that has led to this, as I say, this resurgence of all sorts of programs, literature, and it stems from that culture, though.
Yeah, I think resurgence, I think, is the word, isn't it? Because there has been, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years, especially, maybe slightly longer even, a number of fairly mainstream Hollywood type budget films that have been very influential. I think I'm thinking of sort of Midsummer and The Ritual. And actually Get Out is one of my favorites. So I don't know if you know that one, but why do you think it's sort of become such a sort of like a more prominent genre in the recent period?
I think there's a number of reasons. The first is that all of the culture we were just talking about is now readily available. So all of a sudden you can watch all of these things again, whether they're on YouTube or DVDs or whatever. And that's a new bedrock for certainly younger writers and filmmakers. I wasn't alive to watch the BBC ghost stories when they went out in the 70s, but I know them back to front because I've obsessively watched them on DVD. I think that relationship in itself has allowed all sorts of bizarre cultural relics and artifacts to come back and actually have some currency with younger filmmakers and writers and whatever else. So that's a big factor in it as well. I also think there's actually a subcultural thing going on now with folk horror especially, where people buy into it. So it becomes like the equivalent of being a bit of a goth or an emo like 20 years ago. It's become a thing where you buy the zines, you go to the film screenings, you go to the events. It's almost a cultural thing that every aspect of your life gets tied up in. You'll have the tote bag, you'll have the magazines. I think that actually plays quite a big role because subcultures haven't been as strong over the last 10 to 15 years. And this kind of thing, sort of fandom kind of thing, have become more powerful in that sense.
The interesting thing about that is, of course, obviously a lot of these, especially the sort of 60s and 70s British folk horror type things, often dealt with sort of marginalized communities. And I mean, I remember you have a documentary segment where you talk about Penda's Fen, I think, and that one obviously is quite heavily tied up with ideas of sexuality and isolation and ostracization. Did you want to maybe talk about that one a little bit?
Yeah, I think one of the great things about folk horror generally is that it's incredibly, just by dint of its angle, it's very class aware. It's looking back at laborers and working class rural communities in particular, in a way which, if it was done in sort of period dramas of that era, it was more sort of yokelish, it was more cliched, whereas in these films, they actually have real importance and agency. Penda's Fen's an interesting example because its director is from where I'm from, which is a very working class area, and he's directing a drama about, essentially, I think it's a private school boy who's struggling with his sexuality, and that's and that's being fed into with the Malvern Valley landscape of that. And it's almost as if the genre allows you in to these unusual relationships between identity anyway, in a way which is unusual for the period, at least. It's probably not unusual for now, but certainly in the 70s, for that to go out on BBC Two is probably quite a radical thing. And people do, again, you speak to people who watched it live then, you speak to people now, you go, I remember watching this bizarre drama and it stayed with me. And they often talk, I remember that boy talking about, his struggles and how he was dealing with it on screen. So I think that does play a role in it to a degree. But it's probably also the fact that the era that stuff was in is probably that context makes it far more fervent than it probably seems today by comparison.
Yeah, so it's often dealing with these quite sort of like radical or controversial topics as well. So as you say, you talked about class in particular, and I think that you're right. There's a thread that comes up a lot is these sort of differences between working class and the landowners maybe, or and with
the Wicker Man's the great example of that, because essentially it's a film about an aristocrat who's basically tricked his island serfs into tending the land for free by selling them a kind of sexy paganism. I mean, that is the narrative for us. And to maintain his power in that, he's decided to tell them that actually you're going to have to kill this policeman because, hopefully the weather will improve and we can get the apples to grow again, and I can continue to be this lord over my serfdom with the workers just, having a good time afterwards, but essentially working for, me for free. It's often lost in the Wicker Man because the Wicker Man's got so many amazing moments and images and whatever, but actually underneath it all, that is the context of it. And then Sergeant Howie is the fall guy for that, though he could have saved himself if his own belief wasn't so strong in that film, ironically.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Wicker Man is so often held up as like the quintessential like archetype, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why do you think that became? Why do you think that particular film became the icon of the genre?
I think it's because it just taps into so many different genres. The Wicker Man itself has a following beyond folk horror. There's a whole fandom of a Wicker fandom, if you like, that are obsessive about it, partly because quite a chunk of the film until recently was lost. It was butchered by the studio because it went out as a double bill in 1973 with Don't Look Now by Nicholas Roeg, and they needed to trim it by maybe 15-20 minutes, so they basically butchered the film and put out the version which the director wasn't happy with, and then the cut bits ended up under a flyover somewhere as landfill. And for years, it became this treasure hunt that where is this final cut? What happened to all the other bits that went into this film? So that plays into the popularity of it. But I mean, who can describe The Wicker Man really? Yes, it's a folk horror, but it's also a police procedural. It's a musical. It's a folk musical. It's a horror. It's a comedy at times. There's very few films that do all of the things The Wicker Man does. And in fact, actually, it's telling that Robin Hardy himself, the director, couldn't do it again. He did try with a sequel or a prequel many years later, and it just didn't work. It's a very special moment, that film. It's a very unusual moment where someone was given absolute freedom, and then the studios saw the film and went, "Oh my God, what have we done? Let's cut it." But actually, they just didn't appreciate the fact that he and Anthony Schaefer, the scriptwriter, were just very, very good.
Yeah, brilliant. So I think we've got about 15 minutes left. So and I think we've sort of like covered a lot of the key points, haven't we? So do we want to maybe open up for questions? Do we have a hang on, I got a mic. Hang on. There we go. Right. Is one of my volunteers able to come and grab this and hand it to anybody who's got questions? Thank you, Grace. There we go. Right. So yes, if anybody would like to ask or just start off a bit more of a conversation, pop your hand up. So.
Hello.
Hello.
Is it on?
Yes, we can hear you.
So this genre isn't just British, is it?
No.
It's global.
Yep.
So can you tell us a bit more about sort of the global roots of it? Because you talk back to the 60s, 70s and back to the 1800s. Do you want to give us a little bit more about maybe some of the oldest bits of this?
Yeah. So one of the things I've been saying for quite a long time is that if folk horror is all about tradition, belief, and landscape, and they're the key factors of it, then that can apply to anywhere that has a landscape, folklore, tradition, etc. And you'll be surprised at how many different countries and nationalities and cultures actually end up doing very similar things with the same material. The examples I always come back to are Japan has a very strong folklore tradition, especially in cinema. There are some really great film examples, Onibaba and Kwaidan, and quite a few from that period, film-wise.
And are they set in the landscape?
They are. So they're set in very specific Japanese landscapes, reed beds, but they're building on Japanese ghosts and folklore, which has a very distinctive flavor. So even though it's doing quite similar things, they're actually quite similar to M.R. James, actually, in the way that their ghosts work. They're often quite animalistic. They're furry. They've got claws. They've got teeth. But it has that distinct Japanese flavor. And again, if you look at any other country, they tend to, in the filmic examples at least, maybe not so much the literature, they do similar things. They put people into a landscape, a rural landscape that traps them, and then things come at them. Sometimes people, we always forget actually that in folk horror can be folk as in people. It's the bad things that people do. And again, that can apply to anywhere. But I mean, there's a great Czech tradition of folk horror cinema. There's plenty of, H.P. Lovecraft is described as cosmic horror, but I think sometimes he tips into folk horror, and he's American. It's all over the place, really. The reason why we do talk about the British stuff a lot more is simply because that's the stuff that formed the ideas of the genre and how we talk about it today. It's by no means the end of the story at all. In fact, it's only really the beginning of it. We were talking about a film before, Kiela Janice's film, Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, and that's a 3.5-hour documentary about this genre. And I think only the first 40 minutes is British, and then the rest of it goes to all sorts of areas and territories. And I highly recommend that. I think that's on Amazon. I highly recommend that for more global examples and how that works, especially in film.
Okay, anybody else? Any other questions here? Yep, over here.
Thank you. To what extent is the growth of interest in this genre related to the fact that worldwide you have had a tremendous, in the last 200 or 300 years, movement of peoples from rural society into urban society? And we've now got a situation where most people have increasing or decreasing contact with the land. And therefore, something that was everyday to people and to the vast majority of the population, and very routine and hard work and all the rest of it, suddenly becomes slightly more mysterious. And you also have an urban population that has a leisure time to think about it and fantasize about it. And that's the question.
I think it's a great point, and it's totally true. This is a very urban perspective genre. All of this stuff is made by the BBC in West London. It's made in the studios in Outer London, the Orbital. So that is naturally going to inflect how certainly the landscape and the approach to it is seen. Ironically, the stories also are often about that. So it's not only there in the view of the people making the stuff, but it's there in the characters, and they're a good translation of their views, actually. There's a really wonderful play for today which captures this. Her view of life, which was derived from sort of upper class London, has no purchase in this Oxfordshire landscape. And the horror stems initially from her misunderstanding and not reading the signs from the people around her, the locals around her, that actually there's something coming up. Mayday is coming up. There's going to be a sacrifice. There's going to be something happening here. And there's no translation for her because she's a television producer at the BBC in the 70s. That's the narrative. And I think actually this genre wouldn't exist if that transfer of rural to urban hadn't happened. As you say, it colours everything, which makes it interesting, but it also means sometimes, certainly in the more pulpy end of the films, it can be very condescending. It can be very, you've got those old ways down there, haven't you, sort of thing. And it's just, it shows its cityness. But again, the genre wouldn't work without that tension, I think, which is why it can be quite a controversial genre as well, actually, I'd say.
And the horror is a genre, as a broader genre, often deals with what are, at its core, what are the things we fear. And, you know, and as you say, in this case, it's this sense of this urban population sort of fearing what they no longer are familiar with in the countryside.
Yeah, it's the folk.
And
It's the folk
and
folk
perhaps
horror.
that's like part of why there was this sort of fairly strong tradition of this in the 60s and 70s, because you had a bit of a movement at that point to start to recolonize those, for urban populations to start moving back out into the countryside. And it's like, what will we find there? You know?
Yeah. And they
Yeah.
did, and we forget as well, actually, that certainly the Robin Redbreast and also the Wicker Man were based on culture which descended from a true story, which was a witchcraft murder. It was the last witchcraft murder that happened in this country, which was only in I think the mid 1950s. You know, the murder of Charles Walton, I think, who was found with a pitchfork through his throat and ritualistic things around him, and that was 1950s. So we didn't actually pick up on this stuff from nowhere. There was elements of this in rural climes, and we forget as well, actually, that getting to rural places, even in those times, you know, the motorways were still being built. There was still real isolation, and some of these old ways did actually, as that case showed, did still exist. But again, as media picked up on this, it did become very tropish and very cliched. But folk horror does run with it in a very particular way.
And it's interesting, you can see elements of that concept going back so far, because I mean, writers like John Buchan were writing about areas of like rural Scotland that were so isolated that maybe something could exist there that was like really ancient and like you know, animalistic, sort of, you know, troglodyte type.
And he is the author
you know.
of the best folk horror novel ever made, which
Which one
is
is it?
Witchwood.
Oh, I haven't read that one yet.
Which I highly recommend. If you want to read a folk horror novel, I highly recommend Witchwood by John Buchan. No.
Read it properly to know it was about horror at last.
I'm so sorry.
And so it's very interesting, and I always come to think from a psychological angle, and to me the earth and landscapes are healthy and sound. So I want to know, is it mainly people who had anxious childhoods that
quite possibly.
Yeah.
I don't want this to turn into a
Do you
therapy
have
session
any
for me, but
thoughts about
I would say that Alan Garner was bedbound for quite a long period during his childhood. M.R. James was left alone for a large part of his childhood, and he could only be, it was only ever pastoralism and pastoral ideals of our idealization of rural landscapes. It loves turning that on its head and going, actually, these beautiful places, if you go there, you might not get what you think. And it may just
then sometimes in other kinds of media you have ghosts that aren't necessarily literally dead people, but this idea of like the land remembering like terrible things that have happened there. So would you say it's more usual that that kind of horror comes from like the land itself, like something inherent in the land, as in like, you know, sort of things beyond humans, or is it this idea of humans bringing that sort of darkness, or the land absorbing that darkness and horror from people, rather than that just coming from the land inherently?
I think it can be both, and I think it will vary depending on what example you're talking about. So the former, which is that the land could be perhaps tainted by something that happens there, sounds very much like an idea called stone tape theory, in which is partly popularized from a very scary Nigel Neal play called The Stone Tape, in which a room has turned out to have recorded something terrible that's happened there, and these electronic sound engineers become obsessed with trying to figure out how it's done it so they can market it. And they don't realize that underneath the initial layer of the traumatic happening, there's something worse underneath the tape. And that's quite a popular idea in paranormal studies, the stone tape theory, that a building or even a field, something bad's happened there, it might somehow retain it. So that sounds like what you're talking about in those other examples. In regards to the people, the idea of passing down folklore, whether it be more cliched folklore or urban folklore even, I think that can be just as powerful. So again, it comes back to what are we talking about? Are we talking which films, which books? Yeah. Plenty of writers have done both, especially with, you mentioned like ghosts aren't people. M.R. James's ghosts are more demonic, I would say, as a whole. They're not the spirits of people necessarily who have died and are lingering or haven't crossed over, whatever you want to call it. They're very, as I said before, animalistic. He's got a thing about fur. He's got a thing about a fur clawed hand touching him. But one of his most startling images I found as well, I always come back to, I can't remember what story it's from, but a character is asleep and they put their hand under a pillow and they feel just a mouth. And when it comes out of nowhere in the paragraph, but again, there's no sense that that's the mouth of someone who's deceased. It's just, it's a creature. It's something beyond that. So they actually find those more scary than the idea of a spirit of someone. But the simple answer to your question is, you can go both ways with it.
Okay, I think we've got about a couple of minutes left. I think maybe I would like to ask you briefly about your work. So you have a number of books that you've published, both fiction and non-fiction. So if somebody wanted to pick up and read one of your books, what would you recommend?
Well, I think at least 2 of them are out of print now, so it's probably a bit late. But there's this one which I've been reading from, which is just a collection of my non-fiction. I've been writing about this sort of stuff for about 15 years now, and haven't compromised on it, thankfully. So it is just all weird nonsense that has interested me, and not the usual stuff. But before that, I published 3 novels. And the third one is probably the one I would recommend, Nettles, which is influenced by Penda's Fen, actually, which is all about haunted childhood and spirits of the landscape where I grew up, which is on the Wirral on Merseyside, the marshland, and also the motorways I used to hide under and that sort of thing. So that's more in keeping with the sort of stuff we've been talking about than any of the other books that I published. My first book is an academic book about folk horror, and I sometimes get sent paragraphs sent to me, and I have no clue what on earth I was trying to say.
Like, what does this mean? Well, I don't know.
I was in the middle of a PhD, and I was a PhD on a different subject, and I was asked to write that book. And it was a very poor decision in terms of health and time-wise and whatever else. But it's academic writing is what it is. It's endless sentences of which you get to the end and sort of ponder what on earth you've just experienced and what was that about. So I wouldn't recommend that one perhaps, but certainly my last novel, Nettles, and
this one I think feels like quite accessible because it's lots of short essays, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So
it's designed to be dipped in.
Yeah,
it's certainly not page-to-page reading. It's more if you're interested in a particular writer or a particular film, there'll be a couple of chapters in there that deal with different aspects of it. And in particular, there's a lot of wanders in there of me going to find locations and places to do with writers and filmmakers, and there are a grand total of 2 copies with me.
If anybody's really
anyone wants
keen,
to buy them, I don't want to have to carry them back with me.
Wonderful. Yes, we did unfortunately have a bit of a supply chain issue with getting any of Adam's books in. So yes, we do have some QR codes if you want to check out some more of his books and his writing and also your filmmaking, because all of your YouTube things are on your website as well.
Yes,
and I've done one for your website, so you can investigate that. I said some of you may have come here sort of slightly by mistake, but I hope that you found it really interesting. I hope that you found you've dipped into a new subject, and I think that's one of the wonderful things that a Litfest like this can do, is it can bring these esoteric, nerdy subjects to light, and we can all sort of like learn something that's a completely new subject to us. So I hope you've all enjoyed the talk. I'm going to give Adam a nice round of applause. I hope you'll join me.
Thank you.
And just on your tables there, you'll see we've got some feedback cards. If you'd like to make some comments on there or anything about the talk, the organisation of the talk, and various things, then please do. It helps us to inform what we do in the future, to know where we can improve, and what kinds of content people have enjoyed, and why, and so on. So are you hanging around for a few minutes, Adam, after this?
Yeah, I'm here for about half an hour.
There we go. So we'll just we will mingle for a little bit. The boys will be packing down some equipment and things, but you're welcome to stay and have another drink here. The Riff Corner will be happy to have you for a little longer. So one more round of applause, and then we'll conclude.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you so much.